So my name is John Wonderlich. I am, you'll have to forgive me, I wasn't here yesterday, I just got in at midnight. I am the policy director at the Sunlight Foundation, and a lot of people have probably heard of us. We're the DC-based nonprofit dedicated to more open government. No, I'm fine. So I'm slated to talk about open data in the Sunlight Labs. The Sunlight Foundation is a big nonprofit, and we have a team of 15 or 18 developers building tools and databases that many of you may be familiar with. If you go to sunlightlabs.com or sunlightfoundation.com, you can check out demos of those tools. But I actually I have a kind of a particular question that I want to ask this morning, and hopefully it only takes me 5 minutes to ask the question and to frame it. And it has a little bit to do with this morning's announcement, and also with our experience in the United States in dealing with President Obama's Open Government Directive, the political commitments that he made, and what I feel like we've gone through in the last year, which is coming up against the limitations of that commitment and that directive. So the longer history behind what happened today, today's announcement about spending transparency and the Obama directive, in my mind, is that we have inherited a number of transparency requirements that grew out of the modern administrative state. So the Freedom of Information Act in America, the Ethics in Government Act about ethics disclosures, the Sunshine in Government Act and the Open Meeting Act, all in the administrative procedure requirements. Each of these things grew around the administrative state, and they're designed based on minimum requirements. So if there's a public meeting where decisions are made, then it has to be announced beforehand in a journal, right? Or if a citizen makes a formal request for a piece of information that's well-defined, then the government has to release it. Each of those policies is built around a minimum standard, right? And that's the system that we've inherited. And what we're dealing with now, on the other end, from those minimum standards, are aspirational standards. So President Obama's Open Government Directive said, we're going to be as open as we can, as often as possible, right? And it's ultimately aspirational and non-binding on one hand, or today's announcement, which is, I think the limitation there is that it's an ad hoc decision that's limited specifically to spending. So there's a certain ideological angle to a decision about transparency that's mainly focused on exposing government spending. So the tradition that we're inheriting is systematic but limited only to very slim circumstances like open meetings or the ethics disclosures of top officials. And then the things that are happening now are either aspirational or devoted to narrow things based on ideological goals. So if you look at Obama's Open Government Directive, it tries to change the entire government without a whole lot of teeth and sort of matches, I think, in certain ways, President Obama's personality. And you could say the same is true about today's announcement, which is focused on limiting and exposing government spending. So the question that I want to ask is what can fill the space between the systematic requirements of the past that are based around very narrow things that are well-defined, and what's coming to replace it, which is vague aspirations and very limited initiatives around ideological goals. So how can we approach transparency reform and access to government data in a systematic way that moves beyond vague aspirations or narrow ideological goals? What can possibly fill that gap is the question that I want to ask. So we could talk about 1,000 other topics too, but that's the question that I wanted to ask. So maybe I'll open that up to see if that inspires any reaction from anybody. But that's the question that this morning left me with. Does anybody have any? Yeah.
Sorry. My comment goes to the premise. The narrowness of today's initiative or today's announcement, I don't see it narrow. I think that transparency commitment on public spending and public contracts of all things, I would call that narrow.
Fair enough. I don't want to understate the importance of that. I think it's enormously significant and obviously is a risk that is undertaken, that's being undertaken. So I don't want to understate the importance of that. And maybe this is coming from my perspective of someone who spent a year praising Obama's Open Government Directive to come to realize its limitations and the degree to which it solved problems and didn't solve problems. So that's the critical eye that I brought to today's announcement. To me, the question was why that set of information, what priorities does that represent, and what priorities are we therefore ignoring? Not we, but are being ignored. And so what sort of approach can avoid having that limitation? Not that I don't want to say that it's short-sighted or limited in that sense. I'm just talking about the systemic limitation of having a transparency initiative that's based on one specific kind of spending information.
I'm an academic who's studied there for life, and I perhaps flag up some of the work that Access Info Europe's been doing, which is the link between FOI and proactive disclosure, and the proactive disclosure that's attached itself to the open data kind of campaign. And I think there's a very, very strong meeting point there between them. And I'd recommend the two documents written by them, which are Beyond Access, and another one for the World Bank recently, the name just escaped me. But I think they quite clearly state that there is a meeting point, systematic and kind of expansive proactive disclosure information, which is the part of FOI that nobody ever really discusses, but is as important and possibly less old-fashioned than the kind of request aspect.
Would you like to respond directly, or?
That's helpful. I agree that there
There
were
were two more requests on the side, and then the second one. Sorry, I can't really see it. Did anyone? I saw two hands there, and that's it.
That's fine. My name is Fabrizio. I'm coming from an activist perspective in Latin America and also now engaging into academic work here in the UK. And just to emphasize my point, I mean, I think Helen's work on proactive disclosure and open data seems to be really the key point. But you know, it's also about building a rule of the game. I mean, proactive disclosure and all these sort of nice things you put in the laws usually end up in administrative hassle. I mean, people just don't care about it. So I think there's also about, you know, building with the bureaucrats about these issues. I mean, trying to build capacity and awareness in the state about this issue, and that's not easy. But there is some evidence around there that says that some people inside the organizations actually do care. And I think that Bernard's key point here is like, you know, make us proud about this, make my, you know, my son, you know, be proud of stuff. Maybe, you know, a bit naive, but also it's about, you know, behavioral changes and what you expect. So engaging with them seems to be, I mean, coming from that old administrative background you mentioned, there are tools in there that will help change the behavior. But also, the other thing is that it could even, you have the rule of the game, but then you have administrative stuff that you really need to work with them. And that's it. I mean, you need to engage with them and in all these details where the devil actually is.
That's helpful. I just want to add that I don't mean to come across as advocating a heavy-handed bureaucratic response. In the American context, we have a variety of open government laws that attempted to do the sort of thing I'm describing that are routinely ignored and had no effect at all. We have, for example, a requirement that agencies register all their data sets on the Government Information Locator Service, or GILS. Nobody does, and most of the entries were last updated in 1997. And it's still a law. The statute exists, there's a person, like a named single official responsible for administering it, and nobody ever pays attention to it. So a sort of like index all of your data mandate won't work because it already exists unless there's a cultural force to back it up. So maybe that's a justification for starting off with something like spending where there is such a clear consensus around transparency for it.
First, and then I think we're going to be able to take more questions. I'm ready to go to
just as like, I'd be keen to kind of know what you concretely think is a better approach than what's been done so far. It seems to me like you said, I mean, there's already laws on the books that theoretically oblige different government departments to do different things that they're not doing. I mean, does a law exist if it's not enforced? And does a law exist if the people don't demand that it be enforced? So is the role as someone from the Sunlight Foundation, is your role not more to, or I'm just asking about, to build up cultural awareness and cultural demands for government transparency and government participation? And to do that, don't you sort of have to go through it incrementally and kind of play to the political leanings of, obviously the UK government is right wing now, and so they're all about government spending and cutting back. So don't you have to kind of play to their tendencies? I mean, you can't change the world overnight.
Certainly. Certainly, maybe I'm just relieved that I don't have to be in the middle of a political fight about earmarks like I am if I'm not here. So this is the one time that I can be frank about ideology. You know, if you put me in a room with Pelosi and Boehner, then I'm going to be deeply uncomfortable very quickly. So that's the situation we're in, is talking about spending limitations and earmark transparency and whether bills are online for 72 hours. And so you're right, you have to play all the different angles. One is feeding where there's appetite for more information. One is addressing top-level policy requirements. Another is public education and talking about why demand is important and telling anecdotes about where things are valuable. So I guess I just wanted to be very frank and talk about my perspective and where I see the limitations and just identify the gap that we're going to be working for the next decade to fill, which is what are the fights that are going to be left over.
I mean, obviously, you can't have culture change by dictum, and I think that's been part of the problem, which is sort of what you started with. But at the same time, you know, Tom Steinberg said yesterday that in one of the sessions that you can't really launch anything without a few demonstrable proofs of why it's valuable. And maybe one of the mistakes that was made was thinking that the bully pulpit and the momentum of, you know, change and hope would be enough to say, you know, let's do this too, let's do this too. Do you think that if he had sort of talked even more to Ellen and Andrew and the Sunlight Group and others before, you know, the Open Government Directive had been issued, and launched a few more things that demonstrated it better, there would be more interest?
I have no idea if it would have helped, but it sounds like a familiar Obama narrative, which is to rely on the momentum, enthusiasm of the populace that doesn't necessarily materialize when it becomes a little bit more complex than it was initially described. I think that you could talk about that in other contexts for the Obama administration too.
Okay, well, I think that's
Well, thanks.
Thank you.